So yeah, I'm very glad to be back to the EPFL. I've been looking forward to it. I had last term a very good time with tough students who were taking on a very challenging project, and was quite encouraging also to see the works and the commitment of the students to take on such a project. So today I want to actually talk about a bit about how we were confronted actually with similar problems as these students have been, as well as anybody is who starts working in Asia, and also the potentials we saw in what we found and how we tried to translate it into an architectural strategy about space and the performance of urbanism in architecture. So when we arrived actually in, sorry, I take this away. When we arrived in Asia with this kind of like educational background from the West, we were actually confronted with something which we couldn't grasp at the moment. In the end, it was something where we always felt as architects we are simply missing completely the forest for the tree. So we were looking at an architecture which in itself as a tree doesn't have really the seduction we were trained at. But we were instead confronted with a kind of like forest attitude which we also have never really studied or practiced. Yeah? So all my knowledge I have gained in all these years were in the first few years completely lost. There was architectural integrity, which was not really applicable to it. So what we were finding there was a very interesting concept, which we also actually have not seen in architecture in the last 20 years, especially with this kind of like iconic approach. This kind of like single-handed concepts is basically the idea of complexity. These Asian cities have an immense amount of complexity actually out of a very simple premise, because the same what you have in Switzerland in the old farmhouses, where you actually have like a complex cell of production, living, commercial facilities within, let's say, the farmhouse. So this kind of like medieval understanding of the family as a mini urbanism was a concept which always was, which you see on the left-hand side, was always very inherent in Asian typologies. We're having shop houses, Chinese shop houses, Vietnamese courtyard houses, and other than the modernist movement in Europe, which tried to actually segregate all those functions, put the living on one side, working on the other side. In Asia, actually, this shift has never happened. So this kind of like typology has always existed in the mindset even of the people, also in the way they building. The moment you change scale, and this was happening in the boom of the 80s in the development, the moment you change scale, you actually don't do this modernist move of segregation. Instead, you just scale up this complex program, yeah, to 10, 20 times, up to 200, 300,000 square meter. And what actually came out of it is a completely new set of typologies. Actually something which no architect really wants to look at. They're actually quite the black sheep of architecture. It's like urban infrastructure projects, mixed-use developments. In China, very big live-in factories. So it's like always like a very complex interweaving of work, living, commercial facilities, public life, etc. So with this, actually, we all know about these kind of developments, and they have been massive in scale. We have also seen them published a lot, but it is quite difficult to take them on and to work with them. So I want to somehow explain a bit, before I come to our work, also some of those concepts a bit more. So urban infrastructure projects. After the metabolist movement, actually, what was created, especially in a place like Hong Kong, was taking on this understanding of massive scale and putting it into a continuous development, nearly like a carpet development. So what we have traced here is basically it's a 1,500 kilometer diameter over Central. Everything you see in white is one continuous building. It's basically a series of individual buildings which are linked by interiorized corridors. So it is basically like a complete different understanding to scale of a building, to the size of it, and also to the way it integrates. It is rather an urban approach than an architectural approach. So everything we have learned being trained as an architect to design a building with care, with an internal circulation, is completely blown away by this scale. So if you look at the urban fabric itself from a top view, it doesn't really look much different than any other urban environment. Yet the networking it creates is a huge potential actually for even architecture and how architecture interacts with the city. As we're in Lausanne, I just wanted to understand also a bit what this means in case of Lausanne. So this is also like a 1,500 diameter. As you see here, we have the train station. Where's the cathedral? It's here, right? So this is the old city. So you imagine that basically this network, a network like that on the scale of Lausanne would more or less connect entire downtown into one continuous interiorized space. What it also does on an urban level, because of this massive intrusion of infrastructure into the city, it creates simultaneous relationships between urban circulation spaces, building spaces. So what it creates in the most dramatic scenario is like a completely blurring of boundary, like an eradicating nearly a concept which we are completely used to is the discussion about public space. Yeah? It eradicates it in a way that there is a very strong relationship between public circulation, private living spaces, commercial spaces, and all is in let's say one mega hybrid, which does not really form also a conflict for the city. So these interventions, they basically grow like itineraries through the city, yeah? Allowing basically managing somehow the complexity of the city in a very natural way. Like people really, I mean, if you ever come to Hong Kong, although it looks very chaotic, maybe on those pictures, especially on those photos, it is a very natural way of getting organized through the city. So for us, what we learned, one of the key aspects from there is really that the circulation, the intelligence about the circulation, the natural flow within the building is the one actually which drives also the architecture to So here you see in the end, maybe at the first glance, you might think it's this very chaotic view, you know, you have all this layering of signages, etc. But all these overlaying of infrastructures, they give quite a naturalizing feel of use. Yeah? So what becomes, as a conclusion from there, very important to us is basically we tend, especially in the last 10 to 20 years, and we are also not free from that, we love to design beautiful objects. Yeah? Our profession has actually detached itself more or less, maybe not in Switzerland, but let's say in the rest of the world, detached itself very much from the reality of construction. So we are working with the computers, we are paper architects, the client wants us very quickly out because we only cause problems to the construction process. So in the end we have now not the complex field of architecture left anymore. Instead we try to put all this kind of like creativity we're having onto the places like Hong Kong are much more what we call subjects. So these are cities and environments which perform and interact and not try to pose themselves onto the big plane as an iconic building. The reason why this development came from this kind of called mixed-use development, which is also have been working with this typology last term. It's it's a development which is basically very dependent on the city itself. With the introduction of mass transport to those Asian high-density environments, every was linked to an additive system of a micro-urbanism. So hotel developments, residential offices, service apartments were connected through commercial programs to the mass transport and then back to the city. So what it created, what was a smart thinking process to say, okay, where the most of people really migrate through, became also a very big problem for the cities, because it created these kind of like hermetic aliens placed on the site, which don't really react with the urban fabric anymore. One of the first ones which was ever built was actually inspired, I think, that time by his studies in London, together with the guys from Archizoom, was William Lim's in Singapore, which is the very, very first mixed-use development, having all these functions together in a more dynamic sections, with residential liberated, with a view, offices, commercial spaces. However, this development always causes a lot of problems because it's not linked to mass transport. So it underwent a lot of decline, similar to the Habitation in Marseille, which is actually as an autonomous organism, but way too large for it. So it had, until it now becomes very fashionable, it had underwent a long series of declines. You know? So this kind of like developments, also as you see here, has posed also a lot of questions to the feasibility of mixed use. I don't want to really talk about live-in factories, but I want to basically make sure that also this kind of like mixing of program, especially in Asia, has also gone deep down into the question of mass production and industrial production. So as you see here, workers somehow live in sort of like in nearly urban gated communities, but this time it's not really the communities we know from Celebration and all these resort likes, but they live really in, they go through these gates every morning in this way to have maybe breakfast in the city, but they walk around with their yellow, green, blue, whatever suits, and they live in a very hermetic environment of work and living. So the challenge, I think, for nowadays architects is that exactly those typologies, which nobody really wants to do, are the ones which affect most people's life. And we do think that exactly those typologies are also the ones we have to address, not only from a social responsibility, but also from a moral responsibility. The last typology, which is so-called boutique buildings for all the places which are a bit wealthier already, and this is, I only show this because this is the very first project I ever built in Asia, is a typology which is very much driven by the formal expression of it. So in this particular case, this very wicked building was actually a spa and a restaurant. So also like functions we are not really used to. So what we have tried that time, usually this kind of like typology is used to really work like the like Venturi's duck as an icon, as a signal in the city. So we have at that time tried to rather assign to these two programs which can symbolize its functional needs and characters. So basically the spa itself, because it has a lot of like beauty, naked treatment, has to be pushed away from the city without having too much interaction, versus all the restaurant facilities, of course, come right to the front to create this huge boutique window. So these are, I would say, very much theme park projects, which also are everywhere in those cities. So in the end, the city itself creates, or Asian cities in many ways, create a symbiosis of these hermetic mini-urban cities, like the mixed-use developments, like theme park buildings like those, and generate through there actually a phenomenal new urbanism. It might look awkward in the first place, but it's completely different levels than our European city, which basically I would even say, much more monumental than those places. The second project I want to show you was a project we started actually in the end 90s. It is a project, it was a road revitalization in Singapore. It's a 2-kilometer long strip in the city. And what was happening with a massive development along the city, that all the street was usually low-scale shop houses. And in a matter of 20 years, you can see here all these time charts and steps, they have built at first a few key shopping malls. They became successful, and they started in 20 years to densify those. So all these shop houses went away, and they were replaced by large-scale shopping complexes. However, it didn't really complexify the urban character of the street. It just, through its dynamic, added on more volume. What it didn't do is bring really urban life to it, because you had a lot of series of individual shopping malls which are not really connected. So when we were approached at that time by Singapore government also to do a study on that, we were actually trying to understand at first how is the streetscape organized, and what kind of shopping complexes and what kind of additional programs are there. So this very first column here you see basically is an array of very monofunctional program just related to commercial spaces, entertainment spaces, food and beverages. So these were just very simple, basic facilities. So our intention was actually, for our suggestion to the government was to say not to build new buildings on the site or to beautify just the street, but rather to generate, even based on our experience in Hong Kong, generate much more life for it. So we said the diversification cannot happen along the entire road, but in just 3 major spots in the city fabric. So we don't really look at the whole, but we look at just individual clusters. So started on these intersection points through infrastructural interventions, programmatic intensification, and new planning parameters. So this is one of the hubs where there are intersections under the road which were intensified and linked to all the building complexes. So the idea of this project was basically to say, instead of really just maximizing, beautifying the city, it is rather about really programmatic enrichment of it. Yeah. This is a project which it's actually the only public project we ever had in Asia, and it's also something, maybe the least thing you get unless you're very lucky and you're very large as a company, or you are a very famous company. It's a campus building, similar to our Rolex Learning Center here. It's also has libraries inside, academic facilities, auditorium, computer center, student center, and professor offices. This was a competition we won, and it was on a very, very typical campus condition. These are these American type campus conditions, so it's a big field with individual buildings. The competition aim was to really generate something like a campus life through this project. And the problem with these campuses is always that they're actually very anti-urban. They're very, very suburban developments. So our idea was actually for that project to revert the relationship of urban space and architectural space. So instead of having a circulation which goes around the building and becomes rather interiorized, we actually wanted to have a circulation which goes through the building and works, creates an internal campus in urbanism. So we have a similar situation here. It was happening actually at the same time, this competition at time. So our idea was to somehow link together the building circulation and the urban circulation in an interweaving and overlapping at various levels. It's also a very flat building, and It's now under construction after a long struggle all these years, and there's still a lot of things we definitely are not happy with, like floating columns where they shouldn't float, and it's a money issue. If you have ambitious structures, it's always a money issue, and we have also way too much steel in there, and the client also got us out at a certain point, so the control is also minimized. But as you see here, this sort of, no, it's dead. No. So, never mind. So there are circulation spaces which pass under the building, and because of the very strong topography, also climb up to the building and around it. So this will be sort of like a central campus, where it blurs somehow the boundaries between urbanism and architecture. So because it's very flat and it's very huge. This is a building of 30,000 square meter, and it's more or less one story. So it's really extruded from there. It's you can never really, hopefully, can never really grasp if you're within a building or within an urban ensemble. So this at the moment is our largest project of 200,000 square meter. Unfortunately, we are a small firm, so others usually handle 10 times than that size. But it's a building in Hanoi. The problem with Hanoi is, as some of you guys know, is that it's actually very low-scale development. So it's highly dense, but it's very low-scale. And anything you do which densifies the city will be an alien. Yeah? So our understanding, learning from this kind of like densification process in Hong Kong, we wanted actually to take on a different take than the typical mixed-use development which creates a podium and towers on top. What we wanted to create was really to create an urbanistic project which also interacts with the city in a completely different way than the typical podium box. So the program was a very standard mixed-use development. So we have hotel, offices, apartments, commercial spaces, and even a public school inside. So our notion was actually rather to create something which is both beneficial for the building functions itself, so which somehow works more as a three-dimensional structure, but as well benefiting the urban context. So we were looking at the city around it, which has rather a very small-scale fabric. Like it's still a very Asian type of small-scale development with a lot of courtyard. If we want to do a project which is not a typical podium project, we actually have to address the issue: how do we translate a natural understanding of using the city into a building? So by analyzing the scale of it, and by trying to really create rather urbanism through cutouts within the podium, we actually do create another excessive building height of 10 stories. So to avoid this and to relate to this concept, we just were saying, why not really split the podium level, and we put all the functions on half of the podium functions on the rooftop, in order to create something which relates on a lower scale to the urban fabric, but on the upper scale also creates its own connection within the building development. So sorry, I go back to this one. So what was the program which was able to enable this in this particular case was the hotel. As you know, the hotel has like a lot of public functions as well. So by translating them actually around on the rooftop, it created another level of public podium on a sky level, which then could interact actually with the commercial podium on the ground floor. So this is sort of like the ground floor level. There are a few new developments coming up next to us. So we're space to decide and construction schedules, etc. But as you see, these are rather hermetic podiums which are surrounded by streets. Versus we were trying somehow to integrate the city fabric much more and create a higher level of porosity to the site. We hope we can prove that this actually really works also, so we will see when it's built. Versus then on the upper level, where actually those buildings here rather stand more regimental and create individual towers, we also create another level of urbanism to it. So what it does in section, actually creating a loop. And as you see here on the ground floor condition, for this kind of like plot ratio of 6.0, we try to maintain as much porosity as we can. Also introducing the usual interiorized shopping mall circulation as a rather exteriorized circulation system around this ground floor. Landscape is not from us though, but so, however, with this project we figured out one big problem, and all these projects who are connected at higher floors have those problems, starting with the KL towers and all these other buildings, is basically how do you actually enable public to get up to this rooftop. So the key question then for such kind of projects is definitely the question, the role of the lift. So with this investigation of the lift, we were actually trying to do a little research project, which ended up also in another project we submitted, which was an investigation about vertical circulation. So the problem with the lift is always you enter into a building and it becomes very much privatized. You have to wait in front of the lift, then you go up. So this kind of like natural translation of public space, this hybridization which I talked about earlier about the Hong Kong context, is completely gone once you're inside the building. So we were looking actually at a scenario where we used a rather old technology like the cyclic elevator, which is a continuously running lift. Yeah? These are linked cabins to translate this into a contemporary way of traveling through a vertical structure. The problem is why these cyclic elevators have been abandoned is not because they're not working well. They're actually much better than a normal lift because of its counterweight. They need a smaller engine, they have less maintenance problems, etc. The reason why they were abandoned is very simple, because they only work vertically. So when you step into it, you might fall if you miss the step. So it's a rather dangerous thing. So we have been looking at a scenario, how can we actually make the entry points to those moments rather safe, like in a horizontal entrance. And funnily, we have been actually talking to ThyssenKrupp about this, and Mitsubishi actually is also investigating now the cyclic elevator as a new transport system in especially public buildings. So it was in that sense quite an interesting scenario. We have submitted this because it was looking actually quite awkward also to a Middle East competition. So. Okay, so this is another project which is a mixed-use development project I want to talk about. We were now somehow quite seduced by the idea of how can we actually rather push architecture to being really starting to disappear within the building. So how can we put much more emphasis on the idea of a podium as an urban fabric versus the architecture just as a pure, simple structure, which yes, it might have some iconic quality, so it might build up a conflict to the performance of the public space, but how can we put more emphasis actually on the use of the ground and the urbanism within the building? So this is a project where we used to have a service apartment, hotel and offices, and the idea of this project is rather to link those together with a kind of like vibrant urban fabric, which is more like a village kind of typology, and connect the architecture in a way that it just becomes like an efficient, well, this is not that efficient unfortunately in the end, but becomes rather like a structure on top of the building which just frames this kind of like urban intervention. Because you see, the problem is always also like this: once you try to create something a bit more urbanistic, which has not necessarily a very particular context, you don't really know why you go into certain directions within the project, so it sometimes leads into nowhere. We have this in a lot of projects which try to simulate an urban network in a situation where there is no urbanism, and the roads lead to nowhere. So our understanding is actually to say we use actually the architecture rather as a framework to confine in a very virtual intervention. So this project was basically also seeing itself then as an architectural form on top to confine the site we are dealing with, versus actually on the ground floor something like more perforation with courts coming down, pavilions coming up, and more like a plateau, an urban plateau on this particular site. So the architecture itself, as with this kind of like very large scale arches, starts disappearing towards something like a much more small scale urban intervention. Last project is something which is also a project in Hanoi. It is showing also a bit the conflict architecture in Asia at the moment is having. We are dealing with extremely high density environments, so we are dealing with plot ratios which Europe just does not have, does not know. It's like 6.0, 7.0 plot ratio. These are environments which are putting a lot of pressure on existing fabric. In fact, existing fabric is usually very scarce. Yeah? And this is a project where we try to understand a bit also how can we maintain something of this existing urban life of the city, at least even in a high density development. So our understanding for this particular project was, as it was a residential project, is how do we translate actually now the understanding of a courtyard building into a high-rise tower. And we started, as we usually start, localize the courtyard and then see how we evolve from there. But what we found out, together with actually the aspects of sustainability, because this is a serious issue in a very tropical climate, you know, the residential sustainability of comfort and well-living, we actually use this vertical core to in a way fragment it from inside out. So instead of having just like a cutout within the building volume, it created like a mix of an outdoor and indoor space with little gardens, some spa, jacuzzi features, but a much more perforated environment which also comes around the space. So it's always half interior, half exterior. With very compact, of course, nearly Corbusier-like housing types. And most of those units, basically, half of their facades were only exposed really to exterior. Kind of like shadow, but well-ventilated outdoor space. And the same attitude we tried to incorporate also to the public spaces, where there's always this relationship between indoor circulation, outdoor functions, like in this case the pool and garden. And this is 65 stories tall, so hopefully it will be built one day. Still struggling. And our attitude, and what became quite important also again here is another time this investigation into how do we actually deal with the podium in order not to create this kind of like urban wall next to the existing city, but how can actually the podium itself be beneficial to translate circulation spaces and the city into our development. And we used this kind of like landscape strategy where the interior spaces reflect an underside actually of the exterior landscape on top of it. And that's it, thank you.